Simple Suburban Murder. Tom and Scott Mystery. Book 1. Author Mark Richard Zubro. Publisher St. Martin's Press, New York. Narrator Eric Ost. For Kathy. Chapter 4. His instant confirmation surprised me. Scott asked, "Didn't it bother you?" "No. By the time I found out, I already knew he was slime." "How did you find out?" I asked. "Greg told me." "Greg?" was my one-word question. "Yeah. Let me tell you what happened. One night, when we were sophomores, we were on our way to a basketball game. Greg forgot his Letterman's jacket or some stupid thing. So, we went back to his house. I waited in the car. While he ran in, he was gone a long time. Finally, he came back without the jacket. He was real pale. All night, he was real quiet. I teased him about it. He told me to lay off. I was supposed to sleep over at his house that night. When we got back after the game, he stalked me outside on the lawn. He took a long time about it, but he finally told. Greg found his older sister and my dad in her bedroom. Greg went in there thinking she ripped off his jacket. She did that to annoy him sometimes. According to Greg, they were going at it hot and heavy. That's why they didn't hear him. His sister begged him not to tell. Later, she told him about the deal for better grades. She was a senior and needed to graduate. She got mostly D's and F's, like Greg and me. My dad threatened him, said he knew the computer access codes, and he could lower Greg's grades if he said anything. For whatever reason, Greg agreed to keep his mouth shut. I was glad he told me. I couldn't tell anyone because of my promise. Besides, his sister was always good to me. She and I even did it once when I was in the 7th grade, and she was a freshman. Anyway, I guess it doesn't hurt to break my promise because now my dad's dead. Scott said, "You and your dad made it with the same girl." Phil looked at him in total innocence. She and I were little kids. It was no big deal. I put my hand on Scott's arm to forestall another comment. I asked, "Was Greg angry at your dad?" "He was real mad that night. Kind of stunned and shocked, too. It took him a while, but he got over it. Now he and his sister are real good friends. Besides, Greg learned stuff pretty early. His mom and dad divorced years ago. Greg had sex for the first time in 6th grade. I know it's true because I had sex with the same girl in 8th grade and asked her." "I can't believe kids have sex in 6th grade," Scott said. "Mr. Carpenter, most adults wouldn't believe the amount of stuff we do. They're all working and we have plenty of time after school to do whatever we want. Guys like me and Greg get lots of offers." Scott raised a doubting eyebrow. "Things have changed since you were a kid," Phil said. "I was terminally shy at that age," Scott remarked. I asked, "Do you know for sure if your dad did this with other girls?" "Not for sure, but my guess is that he did. He was scum." "I'll need to talk to Greg again," I said. "Can I tell him you told me all this?" He thought about this a long time. Finally he said, "Sure, go ahead. Tell him I told you. He'll understand." I wasn't sure there was anything more to ask. "How about in general?" I asked. "Was there anything else about your father recently that was out of the ordinary?" "Geez, it's hard to say. I haven't been around that much. I've been into hustling pretty heavy." "Anything at all? Any changes?" "No," he said, slowly concentrating. Then his face brightened. "He did seem stuck for money lately." "How do you mean stuck?" "Broke. There were times when he had tons of money. Lately, he'd been screaming at the kids a lot. That's how I knew he was down on money." "Do you know why he was broke?" "No. Can't help you there." I'd asked all I could think of. I said, "Keith misses you a lot." "He's a great kid. He's the only one I miss. I hated leaving him, but with Dad gone, he'll be okay. I promised I'd get back to him. That's one reason I wanted to see you. Could you take him a message for me?" He took a long white envelope from inside his suit coat and handed it to me. It had Keith's name printed in block letters over the sealed flap. "I'll deliver it, I promise," I said. "Thanks." He hesitated, looking toward Daphne. "I should be going. We're going to a concert tonight. That's why I'm dressed up. Wait, Phil, there's one more thing I don't understand. Why did you leave home? With your father dead, wouldn't life there be easier? It's time for me to make a break, Mr. Mason. I got a solid offer from somebody I trust. I hate that house and all my memories from it. What about graduating? I'll handle that later. School's not important. He pointed at himself. I've got my most marketable asset with me at all times, and I intend to make the most of it while I can. When we didn't say anything to this, he said, Look, I appreciate you looking for me and all, but I'm okay, really. I wished I could believe him. I was afraid. What he was into was way over his head. If that's all, I really got to go. I've told you all I know. I hope it helps you find out who did it. He stood up. One more thing, I said. That's what you said a minute ago, but he smiled as he spoke. Do you know where your dad was that night? No, sorry. He began to move away. I gave it one last try. Phil, you don't have to go back to where you're living. He gave us his dazzling smile. I want to, he said simply. He gave a little wave. Nice to meet you, Mr. Carpenter. See you, Mr. Mason. We stood up also. Daphne lumbered over. You two wait, she ordered. The manager let Phil out the door without looking back. The boy crossed Wacker Drive and disappeared around the corner of the Sears Tower. He's really not a bad kid, I mused aloud. Daphne raised an eyebrow at me. I suppose you're right, she said. The man he's staying with, is he trustable? Will Phil be okay? I asked. Yes, certainly better than he ever was at home, she answered. Scott moved to confront her. At least at home they weren't peddling kids. She shook her finger in his face. Don't you throw that family bullshit at me. Scott grabbed her arm. You're turning kids into whores. His deep voice achieved its angriest rumble. The manager made a threatening move, but this time Daphne wrenched her arm out of Scott's grip. She didn't retreat, though. She thrust her face at his. Her nose landed an inch from his chin. She shook all over and bellowed back. Watch it, asshole! You've touched me for the last time. Lowering her voice, but with her frame still trembling, she went on. Let me tell you something, fuckface. I find these kids. I make sure they don't starve. I make sure they have a place to stay. I keep them away from rough customers. I make sure they're taught safe sex. She backed away from him half an inch. I care for these kids. That boy needed help. I brought him here tonight because I knew he needed to get some shit out of his system. He wouldn't talk to me. He wouldn't talk to his hustler buddies. There was no one else he had to talk to. Somebody. He was completely torn up inside. She whirled away from him and stomped up to me. And let's not get the idea that I'm a lesbian with a heart of gold. I also keep these boys around because it's good for business. Very good indeed. They keep customers coming in the door at the enormous profit a year. Is it wrong? She answered her own question. I suppose it is, but you tell that to some starving, shivering 15-year-old with no place to go. Am I supposed to send them home? Most don't have a home to go to, or not one they're welcome in. As you well know, many parents can't handle it if they find out their teenage darling is a cocksucker. She plunked onto a counter stool, cupped her chin in one hand, and drummed her fingers on the pale green formica. I was curious, I said. I've been told the other gay bar owners don't like you. She looked up at me. That's right. Why not? I'm sure you've heard reasons, but I haven't heard your side. She eyed me thoughtfully. She motioned to the manager. You can go, Derek. He let himself out. I own the franchise here, she said. I've made some good investments. In 2 years, I'll be a millionaire. She got up and began pacing the floor. First, they don't like me because I'm a woman. Second, they don't like that my place makes more money than any other gay bar in the city. Third, I don't get caught. I think they hate that most of all. She stopped pacing, gave me a sly wink. I have no intention of revealing that secret now or ever. She resumed her journey in front of the counter. They probably told you I double-crossed them, that I won't go along, that I don't support the community unity. Those hypocritical bastards. They unite when they're scared. They've stabbed each other in the back 1,000 times. Then when some straight politician smiles at them, they scramble like mad to do the bidding of their friend. The pacing stopped again. Let me tell you, there is no such thing as a friend in the gay community. Among straight politicians, we've had so-called friends in this city for years. They've taken our support, our money, our votes. And what do we have to show for it? She gave another bitter laugh. Look how they've handled the gay rights ordinance. She grabbed her coat from a nearby booth. As she buttoned it, she added in a very quiet voice, I know I'm exaggerating. They aren't all like that, but I get so sick of the snotty few who think they run this community. She swept toward the door. Fuck 'em all, she said as she passed us. Let's go, boys. We moved quickly as she held the door for us. I tried to thank her as we waited for a cab. Save it, she said. Don't bother me anymore, and don't come in my bar again. That'll be thanks enough. She squeezed into a cab. She's an unbelievable woman, Scott said. It was several hours later. We'd eaten dinner at Jerome's, one of our favorite restaurants. We were relaxing in Scott's living room in front of the fireplace. I'd built a fire. He sat up against a couch. I had my head in his lap. My feet rested on a low pile of cushions. As we talked, he outlined the curves and valley of my face with his fingertips. I have mixed feelings about her, I said. I think she's exaggerating about the bar owners. The ones I've met are decent people trying to make a living like the rest of us. I don't agree with what she's doing with those kids, but I understand her reasons. Society will never take care of those boys. She's better than nothing, I guess. I sighed. I do know that if I'm ever in a fight, I definitely want Daphne on my side. I shut my eyes. I felt his fingertips feather over my eyelids. Scott said, I wonder if we can trust everything Phil told us. His answers were a little evasive on a couple of points. I opened my eyes. But overall, I think we can trust him. Can you believe they both had sex with Greg's sister? I don't want to think about that part. The kids had an incredible life. Are you going to open the envelope Phil gave you? No. It could be information about his whereabouts. He gave it to me because he trusted me. I'm going to deliver it intact. I will ask Keith if he'll let me see the contents, but that's all. I suppose you're right. Jim Evans must have been a sick man. I haven't heard one person say anything good about him. Yeah, nobody we talked to is sad he's dead. I'll need to talk to Greg tomorrow. He wasn't very truthful last time. Greg may know more than he told Phil. You know, another thing Phil said made me think. What's that? Maybe somebody else walked in on Evans while he molested their daughter. Some father or mother he couldn't bully into silence. Some parent angry enough to kill. That's real possible, Scott said. I'm going to try Meg to find out more about the father's money situation. She mentioned it when I talked to her. I wonder where the money came from. If at times he had a lot more, I wonder if he tried to rip off the school. You think that's possible? He had to get the money somewhere. I'm also going to do the obvious. When we stop at the Evans' house to deliver Phil's message, I want to ask Mrs. Evans if she knows anything. I doubt she will. Are you going to tell her we saw Phil? I think so. That was the original point of this whole thing. It's almost impossible not to. If we're there to give Keith a message, the lies could get too elaborate. Keith might slip and tell her anyway. What if she tells the police? They'll be pissed you didn't tell them. Let's hope the police never find out. I'll have to think about what to tell them and how to handle it. If we decide to tell them you're right, though, they won't like it that we talked to Phil and didn't let them in on it. I don't want to be around when Robertson finds out. We fell silent. He continued his caresses. I began to feel drowsy. We should get to bed, I muttered. He leaned down and kissed me. We went to bed, but not directly to sleep. Scott drove me to school. He promised to pick me up at 5 o'clock for the trip to the Evans' house. At noon, I sought out Meg. After leaving a parent volunteer in charge, we entered her office. How's the investigation going? She asked. We found Phil. Is he all right? As far as I could tell, but we couldn't convince him to come back. That's rough. Do the police know? Not yet. Be careful. They could become nasty. I told her what we learned from Phil. Her eyes blazed when I told her about Evan's relationship with students. That son of a bitch, she said. I know, I said. I wanted to ask you about the money situation again. Phil confirmed what you said about the swings back and forth. He said his dad was strapped for money lately. Had you heard anything about recent financial problems? No word on lack of money. Doesn't mean he wasn't, though. Phil didn't know why he was broke? He said he didn't. I believe him. I wonder why it kept going up and down. There aren't a lot of ways for teachers on the job to make or lose lots of money. Meg said, as for extra money, I know he didn't have an outside job, and he didn't pick up any new extracurricular duties this year. I don't think... Let me check. I've got a master schedule here somewhere. She rummaged quickly through her files, pulled out a salmon-covered form. She ran her eyes down the list. Nope, he isn't down for any of them. How would he lose money? I don't know, she answered. Or how would he gain it? That's just as tough in a school. There are very few ways to pocket cash. Oh, you can skim tiny bits of money here and there. Steal a pencil or a paperclip, for instance, but I don't see anyone with an illicit black market and magic markers. Makes no sense. There's no real profit in it. You're right, I said. You know, she said, thoughtfully, I've heard where you can skim money from athletic events. There was some scandal about that a few years ago in some northwest suburb. How does that work? I can't swear to this, but I think I remember it right. You make sure you're the one to count the money after a sporting event. You underreport the size of the crowd and skim a bundle off the top. Don't they have people checking? You would think so. I have no idea how our system works here. Who counts it? Who checks the counters? As far as I know, Evans had absolutely nothing to do with any part of the athletic program. She perused the master schedule. He has no coaching responsibilities listed here. It doesn't sound promising, but I'll have it checked out later. I felt discouraged. Is there any other way he could get cash around here? Not that I can think of. There simply aren't that many opportunities in a school for significant stealing. It had to be something outside school. The chances of my discovering what were dim. Meg fiddled with the deck of cards on her desk. Catch those today? I asked. Yes, you should see the collection I built over the years. I could keep Las Vegas supplied into the next century. She gave an uncharacteristic yelp. That's it, she exclaimed. What is? Gambling. Evans gambled? I gave her a doubting look. It's quite possible. At school? You're so naive. The math department for years has run a gambling operation. They set up a system on one of their computers. I hear it's quite sophisticated. If it's a sports statistics, it's in their program. They have it figured for every sport in every season. Do they bet significant amounts of money? I don't know. I always figured it was small time. You'll have to ask them. How did you find out about it? How do I find anything out? I listen. Could Evans have been involved heavily enough to make and lose large sums? That could solve the riddle of the wild swings in cash he had. It's definitely something worth exploring. I'll talk to Vance again. She glanced into the library. Sorry to rush you, but Sylvester's out in the hall. I keep thinking and let you know if I come up with anything else. Thanks. You've been a big help. We left her office. Sylvester stood by the desk, talking to the parent volunteer. He eyed us suspiciously without skipping a beat. Meg picked up a stack of nearby books, handed them to me, and said, Here are the books of plays you requested for your script writing unit. I'm glad we could help you. I thanked her again and left. After school, I asked one of the other teachers to check in on my tutoring students. I didn't think they'd tear the place apart, but I like to be safe, and now there's an adult nearby. I gave them their assignments for the hour. Then I took Greg aside and asked him not to leave, even if I didn't get back by the end of the session. I found Leonard Vance in his classroom. "How are you doing, Sherlock?" He gave me a friendly grin. "Hot on the trail," I said. "Can I check something with you?" "Sure." "It seems that Evans was pretty broke lately. I'm trying to figure out if it's true, and if so, to track down the reason. Supposedly, at other times, he had vast excesses of money." Vance sat down at his desk. He rubbed his hand across his chin. "Broke, huh? I'm not sure about that. Excess, I am sure about. He used to brag about all the things he bought. Fabulous stereo systems, new cars. I didn't know how to put this delicately, so I said, could he have made it or lost a bundle on the gambling operation the math department runs? Instead of taking offense, he gave this idea calm consideration. He pressed his hands against the top of his desk and leaned forward. "I'd say no. I'd have to check the computer records to be sure. We keep close track of everybody's bets, winnings, and losings. Individuals seldom win or lose significant amounts of money. Over a year's time, a person might average a total winnings of maybe $500 tops. Nobody's ever lost more than $200 or $300 in a year. Exactly how much money are we talking about? If it's not out of line for me to ask." "It's okay. We average about $5,000 a week in bets." "5,000? That surprises you?" "Yeah. It shouldn't. That's peanuts compared to most operations. Remember that 5,000 is collectively. We have 50 or 60 people in the pool on a regular basis, sometimes over 500 on big games or events like the Super Bowl or World Series. There's more than just the people at school in on it. Could somebody lose a lot? Say if you backed losers for several weeks in a row. With the whole system computerized, we've minimized the risk. It would be a bad week if someone lost even 100, usually. We break even or win a little. Right here in the department, we don't bet ridiculous amounts. We're teachers, remember? Could Evans have been cheating some way to increase his take? No. When we set up the system, we tried all the cheating methods we could think of and built safeguards against them. Could he have used the information from here to place side bets with another operation? Sure, but we wouldn't know about it. Could he have duplicated your system and tried to set himself up in his own business? He couldn't have an exact duplicate of ours. The disk we use can't be copied. He could set up one of his own, but that's a tremendous amount of work for one person. We have several people for each sport collecting and entering the data. I strolled to the window outside the football team practiced in the November gloom. I turned back to him. But he could have set one up for himself. It's possible, but not probable. Right. And he couldn't be cheating. No way. I'd found out all I could. I prepared to leave. One last thing, I can't resist asking. Aren't you guys afraid of getting caught for illegal gambling or betting on school property? He gave a friendly grin. Not really. Sure, people know about the operation, but we don't flaunt it, and what's to find is proof. A couple of floppy disks that are useless if you don't have the access codes. Significant dollar amounts change hands off school grounds. In my classroom, I found Greg's lean frame draped in the chair behind my desk. The other students were gone. He jumped up when he saw me. Is this going to take long, Mr. Mason? I've got to meet some guys in 15 minutes. That depends on your answers, Greg. To what? He asked. I talked to Phil last night. You did? His attempt at cool only partly covered his surprise. How was he? Fine. All things considered, he told us a couple of things about his dad. Some were hard to believe. Phil can tell some pretty wild stories. He mentioned you several times. I never did anything. He didn't say you did. He talked about the time you guys stopped at your house before a basketball game, and who you discovered inside. Oh, shit, he whispered. He hung his head, stuffed his hands in his jeans pocket. I know this won't be easy to talk about, but it might help. It might be a starting point in finding out why Mr. Evans died, and who the killer is. I can't talk about this, he mumbled. Phil already told me it's only a matter of time before the police find out and begin asking questions. Are you going to tell them? His gaze remained fixed on the floor. I'd rather talk about it between ourselves. His shoulders lost some of their rigidity. Greg, I don't want to bring trouble to you, your sister, or anybody else in your family. You realize if and when the police find out, They might try to connect Evans sleeping around with students to the murder. They'd be dunces not to because of how angry you got that night. They may begin to suspect you. Do you, Mr. Mason? I think you're glad he's dead. You got that right, he said in a classic teenage mumble. I ignored his comment. But I don't think you killed him. I don't think you're the type. But the police might not agree with me. I was with friends the night he was killed. The police told us he'd only been dead a couple of hours. When I found him, he probably died around 3 or 4 in the morning. You mean to say on a night with school the next day you were out that late? Maybe I did get home early, he admitted. Greg, let's make this easier. Help me. Can you tell me what other kids or parents might know about Evan's sexual activity? My guess is that someone else did the same thing you did, stumbled in on them, but that person decided to take matters in his or her own hands. I don't know of anybody, he said. I couldn't tell if he was lying or not. I'd come back to it. A couple other things I need to know. You weren't entirely truthful the other day. You knew Phil was gay and hustling. Yes. Why not tell me this at the time? You're an adult, Mr. Mason. I've never talked about sex with adults. How did your sister cope with you knowing about her and Mr. Evans? I think I was more upset than she was. After the initial shock of me knowing wore off, as long as I didn't tell, she didn't seem to care. I couldn't believe she would be that blasé about what happened. I wanted to talk to her. Did the two of you ever discuss the incident? Yeah, she told me to stay out of her life. That if I told, she could tell some things about me. I'm no Mr. Perfect. I was past the tattletale stage anyway. My mom has enough hassles. There was no point in telling her. My sister and I were very close before that night. It took a while, but we're friends now. He looked at me, held his hand out as if for approval. Was I wrong not to tell? You didn't, and it's over. It doesn't matter now. I thought for a minute, then asked, Greg, are you sure you don't know about anybody else having sex with Evans? Even the whisper of a rumor? He stared back at the floor. No, he mumbled. Greg, I need the truth. His eyes met mine. I ain't lying. For the moment I believed him. I asked, do you know if that was your sister's first time with Mr. Evans? I don't know. Did they do it again afterwards? I don't know. Where can I get in touch with your sister? You're not going to talk to her. I don't think there's much choice. She'll kill me for telling. You didn't have much choice about that. There are a lot of questions about Mr. Evans that people must have answers to. And remember, Phil's really the one who told me first. You shouldn't have to worry. I hope not. He gave me his sister's address and phone number. Finally, he asked in a disgusted tone, Can I go now? Yes, that's all the questions. He hurried out. Scott was in the parking lot when I walked out the door. On the way home, I filled him in. Once there, we did a quick workout, then left for the Evanses' house. I'd found the address in the faculty list. As he drove, I gave directions and finished my chronicle of the day's events. You know who I think is strange? I asked. Who? This Vance guy. What about him? From what you said, he's a pleasant, friendly old codger. He makes me suspicious. We're suspicious of everybody, aren't we? Yeah. I mean, Mrs. Evans, his wife, is on the list on general principles. Both boys are especially. Phil, you don't trust the principal and superintendent. You didn't sound like you believed Greg told everything. Now you're suspicious of Vance? I guess we don't trust any of these people. Until we find the murderer, everybody's a suspect, including the cooperative Mr. Vance. What's wrong with him? Of all the people I've talked to, he's the only one who knew Evans, who didn't hate him. Scott was quiet. We looked at each other as we waited at a light. I said, Don't you find that odd? I hadn't thought of it that way. If Evan was undercutting him constantly, Scott interrupted. Not successfully, according to what Vance said. I have only his word for that, I replied. That's true. And I have only his word about the gambling operation. He could be covering for himself. Evans could have screwed it up in some major way, or he might have found a way to cheat them. Are you going to check it out? I don't know. Anybody in the math department Whoever I asked would be more likely to be loyal to Vance and not say anything. Certainly they would mention it to him. That could antagonize him, and I don't want that right now. The man could be hiding a lot. My original point stands. Why doesn't he hate Evans as everybody else does? Maybe he's an easygoing type, Scott offered. Maybe he's a killer hiding a motive. Yeah, that too. Your list a minute ago didn't include the hordes who might have interrupted Evans in his illicit activities. We talked over other aspects of the case the rest of the way, but got no further with it. The Evanses lived in Mokina. It was a small home with an attached garage. The gray house needed painting. One of the girls answered the door. We asked to talk to her mom. Mrs. Evans came to the door smiling nervously and wiping her hands on paper toweling. She wore a pale pink house dress, no makeup, no jewelry, and a worried look. I introduced Scott, then asked her how she was. Before she could answer, Keith bounded down the stairs and into the room. He wore faded gray jeans and a number 34 football jersey. "Who's here?" he said. Then he noticed us. His face brightened when he saw Scott. "Hi, Mr. Carpenter, Mr. Mason." He turned to his mom. "Do you know who this is, Mom?" he blurted along without waiting for an answer. "This is Scott Carpenter. He plays—" She interrupted. "You must be quieter, Keith. Don't rattle on like that. These gentlemen are here to talk about serious things. Go play downstairs." "Can't I stay and listen?" Mrs. Evans, with the paper toweling crumbling in her twitching fingers, tried to be severe. "Now, Keith, you know you can't stay around when adults have serious things to discuss." "But I always do." "No, you don't." "I do too." This type of domestic repartee irritates me. Scott rescued the situation. He said, "Keith, why don't you and I check out some of your stuff downstairs?" Keith jumped excitedly. "Yeah! I could show you my model planes. I've got the best collection in the world." "Is that all right with you, Mrs. Evans?" Scott asked. "He's being a pest. He knows better now." "Keith?" Her voice lacked all authority. The fire and anger I'd seen the other night seemed to have deserted her. Scott interrupted. "It's no trouble, Mrs. Evans. Tom can fill you in on everything I'd like to see Keith's models." He began to move toward Keith and out of the room. Mrs. Evans closed her mouth on any protest. I handed Scott the envelope from Phil. "Why don't you take care of this?" I said. Scott took the envelope. The eager youngster led Scott away. In moments, their voices drifted up from the basement. She gave me a weak grin. "He's such a handful. His father was the only one who could control him." We sat down on a pair of faded brown armchairs. "We talked to Phil," I said. Her hands fluttered to her throat. "Where is he?" she cried breathlessly. "We talked, but we couldn't convince him to come back with us." Her joyous look turned to confusion. "But why not? He's a very confused young man." "I'm his mother. I love him." "I know that, Mrs. Evans," I said softly, "but I don't think he knows it." "What does that mean?" "He's been through a lot in 18 years. The past week to him probably feels like a lifetime. He's on a roller coaster ride. I imagine he thinks he can get off any time he wants. I hope he doesn't decide to do so at the top of a 1,000-foot drop." "He won't come home?" she pleaded with her look. "Not yet." Briefly, she became fierce. "Where is he? I have a right to know. I want to talk to him." "I don't know where he is," I said honestly. "You found him once. How?" she demanded. "By accident and luck. You're hiding him. You could lead me to him." I met her eyes and held them. I said quietly, "I wish it was that easy." The flash of fierceness in her eyes died. She leaned all the way back in her chair and shut her eyes. She seemed to have exhausted herself at length. She spoke. "Why try to fool myself? He hasn't needed his father or me for a long time." She paused finally. When she looked at me and began to speak, her voice was resigned. "Was he all right? Was he eating, staying someplace safe?" "He seemed all right. By the way, that envelope I handed Scott was from Phil, for Keith. He always tried to care for his little brother," she said. Her lips formed a bitter smile. She spoke more to herself. "When I was little, I wanted a life like those on the TV shows, with Mom at home, a kindly, wise, slightly befuddled husband, healthy, happy children, love." Her tone was wistful, almost a little girl's voice. She wiped her eyes with the remnants of the paper towel. She still clutched and breathed deeply. I guess I wasn't much of a mother. If I was, none of this would have happened. None of us has absolute control of our own lives, or of the lives of the people we love. I tried to speak words that would comfort her. We aren't God. We'd like to be able to make everything right and perfect with a magic wand. We do our best. That's all anyone can expect of us. She wiped at her eyes again and gave me a timid smile. Thank you for your kind words. She paused. I haven't thanked you for your kindness. I've been terribly rude. You found my son and you took the trouble to come talk to me. I can never thank you enough. I demurred gently, then added, Mrs. Evans, there was another reason we stopped by. I didn't know how to approach the subject delicately, so I plunged straight in. It's about your husband. The worried look returned to her face. Yes. We were told his finances often fluctuated wildly, and that he was short of money lately. Yes, that's true. Do you know why this was, or how he worked the family budget? No, I never had anything to do with family finances. He wouldn't let me. All he gave me was an allowance for household expenses. My husband's records are all here, somewhere. I wanted to look at that information. I asked her if I could see them. When she looked doubtful, I said, the information could point to the killer. If we discover who did it, perhaps Phil would come home even sooner. It didn't make any difference if that logic was true, just if she believed it. My last comment seemed to decide her. I suppose, she said. She went to a beat-up old desk along the wall on the way to the kitchen. From one of the drawers, she took various bank books and papers. She spread them on the desktop. She said, the police have gone over all of these. They didn't say they found anything unusual. They also didn't find Phil. Maybe I'll see something they missed. We stood at the desk and went over the records. Her ignorance appalled me. I suspected she'd never balanced a checkbook in her life, or even written a check. What little there was to look at seemed perfectly normal. The statements were in order. The list of paychecks was meticulously accurate. The dates checked out with our paydays for the past few months. There were no unusual entries of money received. The payouts, too, were normal, ordinary household expenses for each month. We went through it all. At the end, I was none the wiser. He didn't keep any other records? No, he did everything on the computer upstairs. Then he brought the information down here and made entries. If he had computer records, there might be more on them. Did he save those computer printouts? No, at the end of the day, he ripped them up into a million pieces. Could I see where he worked? She led me to an upstairs room. This was his office at home. She flicked on the light. The place was profoundly neat. Not a paper was out of place. All materials were in proper slots, in exact parallels, or at rigid right angles to each other. Did the police search in here? Yes, they said they didn't find anything. My husband only kept school things here. The family things were all in the desk downstairs. I walked around the room. There were 2 3-foot shelves filled with math texts and computer books. The computer sat on a gleaming steel desk. Next to it was a bin for floppy disks. It was empty. Were there disks in here? I asked. There used to be. Someone broke in the day my husband was murdered. Whoever did it left a mess, but all they took were those computer disks. Do you know what was on the disks? The police asked me that too. I only remember they were math games for his classes. I don't think the police spent much time in here. It's all school books and papers. She ran her hand along the bookshelf. I put everything back in order the way my husband kept it. I don't know why I did that. You're sure all they took were the discs? Oh, yes. I'd know if anything was missing. I dusted in here every day. Jim insisted on it. Ideally, I ran my hand over the computer keys. Why would they take the discs, I wondered. For no good reason. I flipped on the computer. I was surprised when a program began to appear on the screen. She moved across the room and joined me. Has anyone turned this on since his death? I asked. I haven't. The police might have. Or they simply didn't think there'd be a disc left in the drive. And whoever broke in didn't check it either. The computer settled down to a sedate blink while asking for the user's identification code. Mrs. Evans, do you know the access code? She gave a little girl shrug. No, I'm sorry. I turned off the computer, flipped the lid on the disk drive, and took out the disk. It had no label or other identification markings. May I take this with me? I suppose, if the police... A loud crash and a resounding thump interrupted her doubts. There was a loud oof, a brief silence, and then uproarious laughter. Gay Mysteries audiobooks. I think it is easy to hate a label, but a face humanizes the word. So this effort is twofold. To offer comfort to those like myself that your world didn't end because you don't fit into the view of acceptable society on both sides. And in hopes of helping those with family that are LGBTQ, that it doesn't mean we are aliens from the child they once knew. Reassure them so they can maybe be supportive at the same time, being true to their values.